Recording and welcome everyone. Welcome. I'm Dr. Heather Zeng with the School of Social and Behavioral Sciences at Capella University. And I'm here co-presenting with Dr. Weiss, who will both formally introduce ourselves in a bit, who is working with Yorkville University. And we're talking about Schlossberg's non-event transition as it relates to virtual clinical supervision, and specifically looking at a faculty supervisor vantage. And we want to acknowledge the Chicago School for accepting our presentation and look forward to sharing further. Whoops. There we go. So again, I'm a counselor educator, and I've presented a lot on online learning, teaching, career development, creativity, and counseling. And I've done a lot of international development work. I've worked on projects collaborating with African leaders and African women leaders. And really, my formative training was at Colorado State in counseling and career development. So I bridge mental health and career development. And I'll let Dr. Weiss introduce herself.
Thank you, Dr. Zeng. Yes, I'm Dr. Alyssa Weiss. I am from Florida, and I am a full professor at Yorkville University. I have done a lot of research on families and children with special needs, which really gets my interest with transition theory, because that is a lot of anticipated transitions and unanticipated transitions, what to expect and not to expect. I also have a full-time private practice down in Florida as a counselor, and I'm also with the counselor educator. So thank you. And thank you again to Chicago for accepting the proposal. And
yeah, and this has been a conversation Dr. Weiss and I had early when the pandemic set in, just kind of trying to debrief, and get at the heart of what specifically people were experiencing. And we met, a number of times on Zoom, and we really saw the connection with kind of this universal challenge of mediating uncertainty. And certainly we saw the effects in ourselves and adult graduate students that we work with, and those specifically mediating full field work at a distance, and even colleagues who maybe for the first time were transitioning to teaching online and had previously been solely in person. So, this presentation will really take a lot of vantages where you can use these constructs. So we're looking at, expanding your insights on virtual supervision and mediating students' transitions, specifically non-event transitions, which we'll define. So we're going to provide you with a bit of a language around that. To afford participants, identification of non-event transitions. People don't talk a lot about things that don't happen to us, but that we have kind of a grief loss response to, and how to debrief these, and offer faculty, who are working with virtual supervision around non-event transition. So that's where we're going this afternoon. And, we're going to talk about Schlossberg. Dr. Weiss is going to dig deep into the model. We'll share an exercise around the model that you certainly can take and make your own. That's an adaptation of Schlossberg's 4 S's. We'll talk a little bit about virtual fieldwork planning and virtual fieldwork experience. We'll talk about an agile approach to teaching and learning that we think has a lot of efficacy around working with students in transition, specifically in fieldwork. We'll do another exercise, and we'll talk a little bit about career transition support. As I introduced the Dr. Weiss to dig deep into the model, it's important to create kind of a chronology or timeline. You know, this comes from a theory of adult development. And we know that in Daniel Levinson, he wrote The Seasons of a Man's Life in 1978, which was kind of co-enmeshed with Gail Shee's passages. And these were predictable life stages at a different time and place in the US in terms of diversity, culture, and focus. So there were some limitations when we look at those now. And then Bridges came out, he was an English professor, came out with Making Sense of Life's Transitions and Changes. And that was in 1980. It was kind of a roadmap. And then Schlossberg kind of tapped into that in 1981. We've seen some continuation of Schlossberg's work because essentially this framework is very nimble, it's very adaptable, and it really gives the language of transition. And you'll see as Dr. Weiss shares, the only recent writing that we include in the references that really does approach cycles of transition or change and transitions within transitions is Carol Vecchio's work on The Time Between Dreams, which is actually a quote from Bridges. So we've shared all these references. So I just want to set a timeline that Levinson was working long in the field. Gail Sheehy kind of tapped into it in a more popular version. Bridges came and took it into a kind of more of a business model. It still exists. And then Schlossberg really integrated it with adult learners, and a lot of people took it into a lot of disciplines. So that's kind of setting the milieu for what Dr. Weiss is going to share about the theory.
Thank you, Dr. Zeng. So, you know, as Dr. Zeng said, the two of us had this conversation probably a couple months into the pandemic because, you know, although Dr. Zeng and I have taught online, it wasn't that much of a transition for us in that sense. However, I had a therapy practice that was face-to-face, and I always said that I wasn't going to do therapy online, that I was leaving that aspect face-to-face. So then I had that transition to moving to an online therapy, and also my clients had that transition. And then I had students who I supervised face-to-face move on to the online transition. And the students that I was supervising were face-to-face students in graduate school. So they didn't do an online program. So I was also working through that process, you know, my own transitions, my clients' transitions, and my students' transitions. So, you know, we were all trying to define what transitions meant for us. So like as Schlossberg defined, it's any event or non-event that results in a changed relationship. So how were my relationships going to change with my clients now that I'm in front of a computer screen, where I had that face-to-face interaction, as well as with my students that face the supervisees, that face-to-face, and they had that connection. So it means that you have these perceptions that play a key role in transitions as the event and non-event, and it meets these transitions only so defined by the individual experiencing it. So what was curious for me that really got me into this conversation with Dr. Zeng was like, how are the students experiencing this move to a face-to-face supervision versus a online? You know, how did they see the difference with this? Because not only did they move to supervision online with me, they started to see their clients online because their clinical sites closed. So they were really going through this whole transition where they've only been trained to see clients face-to-face. And the same aspect, I was only trained to see clients face-to-face. I was never trained on, you know, Doxy or Zoom to meet with clients. So, you know, transitions can be scary. They can be exciting. There were different, you know, I processed with my supervisees, what was the excitement about moving to online? You know, one of them once shared, well, I can roll out of bed, get dressed in 5 minutes and be in front and only have to have a nice shirt with my clients. No one has any idea that I'm wearing my pajama pants in the session. So, I mean, so, you know, everyone learned to find some kind of comedy in the sense of moving to online. Okay, we're going to go to the next one.
Okay.
Thanks. So now these are the different types of transition. So, you know, the beginning stage in any transition is you're either moving in or you're moving out. And so when an individual passes into this new situation, people must become familiar with their new roles. So I had the students always think, what is their new role as a counselor online versus the counselor face-to-face? Or is that a different role for them? So when the individual understands these types of components, they experience moving through this type of period. So, Schlossberg organized these transitions so they could occur in different ways. So the first one is the anticipated transition. And then you have the expected or predicted events, the unanticipated transitions, which are the non-scheduled or unpredictable events, and the non-event transitions. So those are the expected by the individual in transition, but don't always occur. So let's take the example of the anticipated transition. That occurs predictability, such graduation from high school, graduation from college. These are the ones that we can always plan for. So you know that when I enter college in 2020, 2024, it's anticipated that I'm going to graduate. It's not going to be a surprise. And most likely it'll be a surprise if I'm not graduating in 2024. So then you have the unanticipated transition. So that's not predictable or scheduled. A sudden death, a divorce, the global pandemic, not anticipated. Everyone had all of these plans. And then you're told, think of with parents, kids were going on spring break. Oh, you'll be back in 2 weeks. You'll be back in a week. Well, they weren't. They were learning how to do school online. Parents who were working, learning to teach their kids balance working. Students that were in graduate school who were parents trying to manage all of that. Then you have the non-event transitions. So they're expected but do not occur, such as a failure to be admitted to medical school, graduate school. The ripple non-event. So that's felt due to a non-event of someone else. So I have a friend who, very close, had to cancel because she had a big event planned for her daughter in 2020. And she had to cancel this event because of the pandemic. And so that's where you start to feel bad because you're very close to that person, that the effect of it is also on you. And so what you're doing is you're reaching out more to them. You're trying to make the situation better for them so they can try to move forward and look at the positives. Even though they canceled it, there's other things that are going on that could be positive in this case. The resultant of non-event is caused by an event. So I live in Florida, so the hurricane, it's coming. So you have a lot of anticipatory stuff, but I have different expectations. I could expect that this hurricane is going to come and I'm going to have all of this power out and trees. Well, it ends up, it doesn't even come near me. Then I could be like, okay, it's not coming. It's all far away from me. Next thing I know, it shifted. And now I'm in the eye of the storm. Then you have delayed non-event. That's anticipating the event that might still happen. So going back to COVID, you have this anticipation to go to a certain store. Every time you show up there, there's an hour line because now you can't let so many people in stores that things are opening up. So you feel like, I'm not going to wait in this line. There's all these people around. So you anticipate that you wanted to go, you get ready to go, and now it's delayed once again, you go home. So you're like, oh, I'm going to try another day. And you do it over and over. And it's delayed. And it's also that satisfaction that gets delayed. Mm-hmm. The next one is the context, and it refers to one's relationship of the individual to this transition and to the setting in which the transition takes place. And the final one is the impact. It's determined to the degree to which the transition alters one's daily life. So how are you affected by this transition? The next slide. This is how Schlossberg identified 4 major sets of factors that influence a person's ability to transition. And she calls it the 4 S's: situation, self, support, and strategies. So it's really is, how does one handle this journey? How do they live through it? How do they learn to adjust and anticipate these new transitions? The next slide. All right, so let's discuss the first one, the situation. So what's precipitating this transition? This signifies the person's situation during the time of the transition. What kind of transition is it? Does the individual see the transition as positive or negative? Or is it expected or unexpected? Desired or unwanted? Did it come at the worst possible time? Or did it come at the best possible time? Is it scheduled or is it time off? I mean, these are things that also with your students affect them. Like this transition, is it COVID, unexpected? Now they have to figure out, is this a good time for me to be like online? How am I going to handle this situation? Is it voluntary or obligatory? And a lot of it in 2020 was not voluntary. So that produced another set of anxiety as well. All right, next slide. So now the other S is the self. This signifies your inner strength and your coping with the situation. So you have to start to look at your own personal demographic characteristic of how the individual views their life, such as their socioeconomic status, their gender, their stage of life, the state of their health. So these are all these personal characteristics that include this. So these characteristics affect how the person perceives his or her life. So then they start to think, well, what psychological resources does this individual have in terms of coping? What are their coping styles, the coping mechanisms? What do they usually do when these transitions happen? What kind of strengths and weaknesses does this individual bring to the situation? Now, the other thing they start to think about is, what is the person's previous experience in making a similar transition? So if this has happened before, how did they handle it? Were they able to handle it? So with your students, when they're coming to supervision, life happens. So when they were thrown a curveball before, how did they handle the curveball? Can they handle the new curveball the same way? Do they believe that there are options, or do they feel like there's nowhere to turn? This is it. Is the person optimistic, resilient, or able to even deal with the ambiguity of everything? So you now have these individual needs and his or her inner strength, and they have to be able to move through this unexpected event. They're learning to rely on themselves. And this is another aspect. So individuals are trying to figure out what coping skills do they have in order to obtain the balance during these unexpected events. And do they have these coping skills to maintain this balance? Or are they going to fall apart? And it's not going to be easy to make that transition. So they need to look at all of their resources and what they have and how they can use these resources. Okay. So the next one is your social support. So those are your intimate relationships, family units, network of friends, institutions, and communities. So what this is, your support is over time, you establish these different things that have helped you go through different aspects of what goes on in one's life. So example, you have a new retiree moves to a city, knowing that there's no one and there's no support. So they learn to adaptation, but that might be slow. So how do they develop these new supports in this new transition? Or can they not fulfill the transition and they resent the fact that they picked up and they moved? The other one is for like institutions and communities. You have professional associations like ACA, AMFT. For example, I know that the American Council of Education established the Office of Women in Higher Education. So then that had another way of people to have this support and this connection. And the last one that we're going to discuss is the strategies or the coping responses. And they are divided into the three categories. So Schlossberg cites that main coping response are identified, that you modify the situation, you response that control the meaning of the problem. So there are four coping that she learned from Lazarus and Folkman: that direct action, inhibition of action, information seeking, and intrapsychic behavior. And those are those to help you control the meaning of the problem and manage the stress. I mean, there's no single magic coping strategy. I mean, everybody wants that magic button that we can just press and It just disappears. Everything goes back to normal. I mean, I have clients and I have students that want that time machine. They want to go back in and whatever they can change to fix it, we will do it. So we have to learn as counselor educators to be flexible for our students too. And our students need to learn to be flexible in the strategies that they learn to cope. So for example, like if you have a client coping with troubling job change, you could ask the following: are there ways you might change the situation? If not, how can you change the way you see the situation? And those are the same types of questions you can talk to your supervisors about. How can you reduce your stress level? What is it about this situation that's causing so much stress for you? What have you done in the past to help with the stress? Has it worked? So if it hasn't worked, then let's find a new coping strategy to help it make it work. Individuals often ask these questions about what they should do. Like, for example, should we move to Florida when we retire? I'm 40. Is it too late to go to medical school? You know, there's no easy answer when you're considering the 4 S's. And in a situation that's good at this time. You know, we always say it's never a good time to do this. It's never good. So when is there going to be a good time? Is there ever a good time? So I want to ask you guys a question. So now that you've been introduced, a little overview of Schlossberg's, can you think of a transition that you have experienced, and which of the 4 S's set of factors influence the ability to cope with that situation?
So our 4 S's were situation, self, support, and strategies. What comes to mind as you're thinking of approaches or strategies that you've had over the last year, or that you've observed in students? And you can type them in the chat or come off mute.
I wanted to ask you, clarify again the question, because I think Dr. Weiss, I understood one thing and you just added something else. Could you please clarify?
I want you to know if you can think of a transition that you have gone through, and how did you use the 4 S's to implement? You know, was it a situational? Was it, I'm trying to think, I just went blank now that.
Yeah. What, your perceived control, or, did you have previous experience with the transition? So maybe it seemed less, noteworthy, or perhaps that you were, you didn't have a lot of support at the time because of COVID, you were isolated, or your network was somewhat fluxed,
So you're asking for both positives and maybe barriers that may have served or took away from a transition.
Yeah,
sure.
Okay. Well, I'm unmuted so I can talk. So as all of us, I'm a counselor educator, and as all of us, I had to transition both my classes, my clients, and my supervision online. And certainly, I think that out of all of the S's, the support was definitely a positive. I was working together with a group of colleagues, both, at my university and across the states, to brainstorm on how to do that. So that was sort of a protective factor.
Good.
But I think self sometimes gets on the way. So, including some maybe personal experience, sort of worry about health of self and others. So I think one of the stressors that was contributing to the transition as we were all going through was, coping with things that I can't control, right? So kind of coming to terms that there are things that are out of my control and I just have to live with them. And so I hope I'm answering the question correctly.
No, it's wonderful, huh, Dr. Weiss? I think, I think that you speak to two things: the transitions within a transition, right, which are often overlooked, that there's multiple transitions going on simultaneously that we have to mediate. And I think some of that locus of control, Rotter's work, right, that people have different levels of self-efficacy or perception. I've done a lot of reading on, I've lived on quite a few islands, and I'm interested in people's perceptions of control on islands, because typically they're dependent on resources coming in. So there's a lot of fatalism. That's a formal term where you kind of say it as one wishes, as things will happen, and kind of let go in that kind of cultural context. So it's so layered, right? People's strategies and their self-perception around instances, and then of course these transitions you're sharing. Was it Dr. Fazio or I'm sorry.
My name is Anya. Yeah, I go by my
Anya.
name.
Okay. Yeah. Well, it was fascinating, right? Because we had social flux transitions, right, on the background. So we had, that were keenly being, people were affected day to day. And so, these critical events were transitions, society aligned with ourselves and our meaning and our situation. So it's just so many layers to it. So thank you for sharing. Alyssa, did you, or Dr. Weiss, did you want to comment further?
No, you said what I was thinking, so thank you. And again, thank you for sharing your example.
Yeah, it's great. So I'm going to go ahead and share an exercise, and I'm going to stop sharing, and then I'll reshare my screen. I'm going to bring up the exercise, and so you can see it a little bit better. And I will go back to sharing screen again. And let me know when you're able to see that again. Okay. Okay, there we go. Okay, so right now you should be able to see a handout. Can you see that? It looks like a
Yes.
handout. Okay, perfect. Okay, so this is something that we can send you our emails at the end of the presentation. And this is what we call our transition debrief worksheet. And we've used this with fieldwork students and kind of and in a weekly kind of mapping debrief of transitions that either they've experienced or that they've observed in clients. So it's kind of counterintuitive, and I'll take you through it. And initially, the individual is going to look at the types of transitions and impasses that they experienced. And they can print this out, or they can mark a little X, and more than one may apply. And these are all the ones that Dr. Weiss explained. We have kind of a little cheat sheet on the bottom that gives the descriptions, and so students can take a look here and then move up and start to circle or mark an X on which ones that apply. And then they talk a little bit about informally what comes to mind, what they perceive around the transition, what they're kind of experiencing. And if they were to describe it in just a few words, how it's impacting them. Maybe it's like they're stalled, or they feel they're trying new things, or the energy is different. So the words will become kind of the narrative of the student, or what they perceive that they would describe what they're seeing in a client. So again, kind of dual purpose. And then taking a look at the four S's. We call them context, which is their situation, kind of their self, the impact, the support that they have, and then the strategies or actions that they took. And just being able to scribe this in small kind of bullets, or just, short kind of snippets of how they're processing this, or how they perceive a client processing this, can be really great. There was a good book years ago by Harriet Klausner that was called Write Things Down, Make It Happen. And it worked on the reticular sensing apparatus of the brain, the RSA, where it's kind of like, you buy a VW bug that's white and you see a white VW bug. And so what we pay attention to, we see and we kind of honor. And then, there's kind of like little caveats here, accepting failure or errors. It's normal that if we have never experienced this kind of transition, asking for help if we need it, and listen carefully, to themselves. And, aspects of readiness might be why they've avoided confronting a situation, or the kind of the cringe factor, right? Schlossberg has some beautiful videos online. I encourage you to view them. And she says, you don't go to a cocktail party and say, let me tell you what didn't happen to me this week, or let me tell you about the jobs I didn't get, or let me tell you about the relationships that didn't work out. It's not really natural, or our natural inclination to always share those non-event transitions. People would not say, something very sensitive that didn't happen, like maybe the loss of a child, or you can think of many other things, kind of missing, missing being a gifted student by 1 point or something like that. It's almost socially not accepted to kind of share those things. So getting these out can be really productive. And I did this exercise with some students, and it was really fascinating to see, they're sharing some of the transitions that were quite positive as a result of the pandemic. With non-attribution, one shared that they had become very insulated, and they started to look at their old network, and they reached out, and they found they had just transitioned from a divorce, and they found an old a friend that they knew that had also divorced, and they found that they were Googling some topic, and they found that that person had written on this particular area of interest, and they reconnected. And so it was a really this event of the pandemic caused them to think of novel ways to reconnect during this transitional gift of a year. That's a book where a divorced woman kind of takes a hiatus. So this was their gift of this year, and it was really a beautiful sharing that they could they found some of the silver lining. Any responses on the worksheet or anything that you how you might apply this? And you can chat or come off mute. Okay, we'll go to and then I'm going to go.
I just want to say one thing with the worksheet, especially with your students going through a transition, it allows to open up this conversation for them to have. And I think with group supervision, then they start to not feel, I think, alone, because all the other students are starting to actually think about, you know what, I am going through that too. I am not by myself. And I think that worksheet really helps that conversation begin during the supervision process. Because sometimes we think we are alone in these transitions, and that Dr. Zeng and I were saying, like, colleagues that haven't moved, that weren't online, that moved, it's like they don't want to say anything because they think they're alone out there, because like they're adults, they should be able to just jump when it changes, and that we need to be there.
So what would you say if you could just kind of do a one sentence purpose of the worksheet? Because I'm hearing you saying that it helps students stay connected, right? So acknowledge their experiences of transitions or non-transitions, help them feel some of this support from others, how would you, I guess, define the purpose of the exercise?
It's a parallel process, just en route of seeing the transitions and how they affect clients, because they may intuitively, and providing them also some language around transition, because a lot of times they haven't heard that what was the rolling transition, or what is the terminology, Alyssa, where somebody else has a transition and it affects you?
The result, ripple non-event.
Ripple non-event. So I think it's a parallel process en route to understanding our own transitions, to understand what might be useful to process with clients.
Thank you.
Sure.
We have a question. It says, can the worksheet be adapted to be used with clients, and would it be helpful?
Yeah, I mean, this, we put we adapted Schlossberg's work. So if any way that you want to run with this, I think it's, you by all means, and we'll provide that to you if you email us. Sure. So I'm going to move forward in the sake of time. Virtual fieldwork planning is another transition a lot of students went through in terms of, fieldwork planning already. For programs, I know at Capella, we're kind of a hybrid program. And so a lot of students at a distance, are transitioning to securing fieldwork. Some have experience in human services and counseling related areas, but some are career changers. So that can be quite a challenge. So supporting them kind of in their best laid plans around transitions has been really critical during this time. And I think this is, and anyone who wants our slides, and if you're mediating fieldwork planning as a faculty advisor, as we do, you can ask some of these questions in terms of helping to support their transition. And, it's really making sure that they've kind of exhausted all of their possibilities in terms of, thinking about their transition into fieldwork differently. Certainly during COVID, a lot of folks couldn't visit sites, checking in with them, making sure they have tracking system, just like, any type of employment. And certainly, we'll talk a little bit more about looking at factors, like peer-to-peer support in the literature. Online learning peer-to-peer support is really wonderful. Certainly, like I advise students in California, so that peer-to-peer support is vital. There's so many regions in California. I couldn't help students, procure fieldwork for all of them. So connecting is important. And then certainly sound clinical coordination to foreclose on frustrations and being flexible. I think that the 4 S's speak to, understanding assets and limitations. That's the strength of Schlossberg's model. And then seeing where you can co-construct those positive assets to build on. Virtual fieldwork planning has been an issue. And we've talked a little bit about virtual fieldwork experience. Working with clients, that's, been fluid for some students in terms of telemental health. For others, that's been quite a challenge. It's similar to the adjustment of students to the online learning platform. Some say they want to be in class, and rightfully so. They may have had that expectation. So for some students, the challenge with transition can be, that clients might have 6 sessions, they're covered, and they don't come back. So that becomes kind of a situation that students may be taken aback of, who are career changers or not really flexible to mediate those real situations. And some individuals may have a catharsis and just needed to share something, get it off their chest, so to speak, and they may not return. So that kind of transition can happen. And then, in school settings, school counselors in particular may get to know students and they move, or they switch schools, or this year they're at a distance and they really have to really work around how to connect with those students. So those are all situations that, the Schlossberg model can be helpful. And also they might have a perception of their work, and then there's the reality. Again, for career changers, the field can look very differently. If someone is really needs closure, this may not be the field for them. They may not know how that looks in the client. Some, again, that gap between expecting to learn on site and then being at a distance. And if it's not working, helping them to make a plan, and if it's not a fit, identifying what those challenges are. And this really involves, from a counselor educator point, that individuation. Every school has larger enrollments now. So, really that carving out time to individuate, see what those 4 S's are for the student, and moving nimbly with them. So the next area is what can help support the transition process. And I think Dr. Weiss is going to talk about a really fascinating approach that is agile educational approach.
Before I go into that, is there any questions regarding that you saw as a counselor educating doing field work online with your students, that you found that I know we're pressed for time, but I think that is very important, with field work and moving it to the online, because I know some of you had to move online. So did you see anything affecting your students in that sense, that you had to take the time and deal with their transitions? I mean, you can put in the chat, or if you want to share anything.
Well, so what I noticed, a lot of students really struggled with managing their work and their school work, their practicum works, internship work, and life balance. I think that the transition of, fully online was hard enough, that required a lot of telehealth training and, technology adjustment, etc. But then they also were dealing with their personal life that was also having to be attended to. And most of my students do have families. So that was probably the most challenging, because they already were used to a certain schedule that, was working for them, a few days at the site, and then they had daycare, family, schools and stuff. But then when we moved 100% online, clients were dealing with own issues and their schedules were changing. So there were, I felt like my students were really sandwiched between their clients' problems and, attending to those and putting them first, and then attending to their own problems. So we as faculty felt like we really needed to be supportive and flexible with our students, in terms of being their faculty, and really giving them a lot more leniency in timelines. And, we had to adjust our requirements for hours and doing all that in a very short period of time. So certainly being it was more evident that the personal life was getting in the way of professional life for a lot.
Yeah. I think that's shows you how the layers are, right? It's just was really a lot of cognitive dissonance, because they're trying to mediate this while we're trying to kind of tap dance, and maybe a lot of folks are learning how to do all of this online. And then just the shifts from one week to another of what was happening in terms of even policies in their communities, and in their agencies or locations of field work, even they were in flux. So just I think I heard there was a Fast Company article years ago that said adaptation is really the only job skill of the future. And that certainly came to light here, didn't it, with those examples?
Absolutely. But also there was a steep learning curve for some of the more of a digital natives, and how they need to step up being more professional versus those that are non-digital natives, that it almost like my older clients have better time adjusting to the online learning because they did not have some casualness related
Oh,
to technology use versus my younger students that, you know, grew up with some of this tele type of
yeah,
life, where
yeah.
having a lot more, I was finding myself bringing a lot more awareness to the, you know, professional
Kind of
boundaries
the
and
formality of it,
yeah.
right? You know,
Mm-hmm.
yeah, and I think it's funny because, you know, I'm not of that digital native generation, and for me, I think it's trying to be less formal, you know, because I worked in policy and different avenues, you know, many different jobs over the years, and you know, you always show in a certain way, right? You know, that might seem very rigid, right, to digital natives. So it's kind of, you know, I see the continuum. I think it's a great example.
Yes,
Yeah.
thanks.
Yeah, thank you. So this Agile Manifesto, Dr. Weiss is going to share. I think it'll really pique your interest for counselor educators as an approach. There's a lot online about agile educational approaches. So take a listen.
Yeah, I'll try to go because I know we're time for constraints, so I'll give you just a quick overview. So really, this started out with faculty members representing 6 different public universities. And it really was the first that it began was through software development. Those were the people that were really interested in, because it was to determine whether the concepts and the practices and benefits of Agile are applicable to higher education settings. And they found out that it is, because there's positive outcomes by increasing, you know, student engagement, encouraging students to take their responsibility for their learning, and enhancing, you know, the level of quality of collaboration and producing higher quality deliverables. So it's like with the online learning, we're always looking at how we can engage the learners. How can the learners be responsible for what they are responsible for, like discussion questions, showing up for fieldwork supervision. So they have to become accountable. So you're always trying to find these ways. So the first one that we talk about is adaptability. So as educators, we should value the ability that our students operate in an environment of uncertainty. So like we were just talking about, you know, they were trying to balance their clients. They were trying to balance their own life during supervision. So they, you know, a schedule that they normally had going into their clinic somehow kind of changed because their client's schedule changed, because they are no longer just coming in to see them. They're also at home. They also might have families at home. So they had to balance, you know, if they're with kids in school or their work schedule, meetings and everything. So learning is a process of discovery that evolves as the participants are exposed to the different contexts and experiences. So thus, with adaptability, if we are rigid in our expectations, then we lose the opportunity to create this knowledge. So we need to ensure that we're flexible, just like Dr. Zeng was saying, being more adaptable, being more flexible, being more straightforward. So our aim is to develop students to help them navigate in the midst of this ambiguity in this world. So the next one that we talk about is the demonstration and the application. And this value focuses on providing students with the different learning opportunities. So within their specific fields is constantly evolving and expanding. So like for instance, I work with a lot with children with special needs. Research is always out there. And I always have to be up to date with the newest research, in the fact that parents might come in and say, well, I learned about this, I read about this, this could help, could this help my child, could this do this? So even as counselor educators, we need to be up to date with the newest advances to help our students in teaching, whether it's online or it's face-to-face. How do we interest these students? So how we do this is through collaboration. So we encourage the students to listen effectively and provide and receive feedback. So we collaborate requires to be transparent in communication among all parties. So including the ability to listen effectively and to provide positive feedback. As a faculty, we should facilitate meaningful group interactions requiring engagement. So during supervision, how do we engage our students? Some things might be breakout rooms during the Zoom. We also can ask them questions. What went well during this week? What went wrong during this week? You know, what values do you have that are going to help you during the week? What could you do differently? I mean, I gave you a quick overview because I know we're running out of time, and Dr. Zeng wants to show you the worksheet.
So yeah, yeah, the agility worksheet I'll bring up, and it's really uh, is quite helpful. So let me share screen again, and you again, this isn't copyrighted or anything, but this is based on the agile approach to teaching and learning. And so you could share, have an agility work weekly showcase. You know, if students don't want to write it out, maybe they're more visual, they want to draw it, take a picture and share it, or share their screen, or use like draw, or whatever they want to do. But the topics are adaptability through transition or change. What would be an example of that during the past week? How did they collaborate? This is certainly helpful for a team approach. And then, how did they show competency in the field? Certainly this goes with the KPIs that we have to, debrief with our advisees and counselor educator programs. Inquiry, what questions arose? So having them formulate good questions, asking things critically thinking, and how did they apply one concept that they learned, or how are they showing that they're continuously improving? And this is the bottom portion is adapted from Savickas, Mark Savickas in career development, who talks about Adlerian approaches, how sometimes things that we're drawn to, like stories or mottos, reflect our values. So what would be a motto or saying that you would forge this week about mediating transitions personally or professionally? And so that can also give you kind of a mental map where a student is at in terms of their own feelings of efficacy in becoming a counselor. So just a little resource there. And again, if anyone wants these, we can certainly share them. I'm going to go to our next area, which is talking about virtual career transition support and processing that. We certainly provide students, that's where the rubber hits the road, and having students know that their transition isn't gonna be, you do this, you get that. It's non-linear. You may not do just one thing. You may have a lot of different outlets. You may embrace the protein career, which is, that the psychological contract has been broken. So, you have to make work for you. You're going to have to deal with a lot of flux. So, transitions are going to be something that you normalize in terms of dealing with this ambiguity, and really look at multiple avenues in the labor market in terms of their transition. And for us as counselor educators, or for students in training who are attending the session, modeling this capacity to deal with ambiguity is really vital. And certainly this aspect of a lot of programs going online have afforded students to be able to say, hey, I can do virtual work, I can telecommute it. So that's also another, skill set. If we look at the self in terms of, Goodman approaches Schlossberg's work, these are some of the factors, again, we need to take into consideration in transition. These all affect individuals, their health, ethnicity, ego development, spirituality. All of these are to be considered in terms of integral, and the intersectionality of these in transition. Again, just driving home the level of support. Support can include people, institutions, things, abstract concepts, faiths, spirituality, and maybe you'll think of some others. And then strategies, really looking at those things that change the situation, the things that can change the meaning of the situation, like Dr. Weiss was saying, kind of maybe reframing things and managing the stress of transition, because it's really all around. I think a faculty supervisor can really help tapping into the advocacy model. This is something that House and Toporek, that you're probably quite familiar with. This is a resource you can find online, and, specifically driving home self-advocacy, identifying strengths, the positive asset focus like we do in counseling, recognizing signs that may reflect some type of systematic or internalized oppression, that imposter syndrome that we widely talk about, and training skills students and in route in their field work to also look at that psychoeducational portion of self-advocacy skills that are really important to mediate transitions well. And then systems, how are systems affecting the student or the client, step by step developing a plan. Are there any additional barriers? Is there resistance to change? And then access to information. Like Dr. Weiss said, community is really vital in students' transition from a program. To what extent have they connected with that one person in class that they really connected with, and got their email, took that initiative. Sometimes you have to say that because adults, typically it's challenging to make connections as an adult, and so, even volunteering, there's some volunteer match, there's virtual volunteering, or even, helping them to transition, speaking to alums or querying their school on different roles, like we have ambassadors at Capella. So the career style interview, you can find this online. There's some really interesting questions that can be helpful if you're a faculty supervisor or advising students in counseling in their transition, say they're finishing their field work and they're still having some impasses. The slash careers, Marcy Alberher's one person, multiple careers is something that I think generationally people just accept now, that they're doing multiple things, but this is really a good handbook for students who may be have had a full different career, and they're seeing they don't see this as a possibility. And then realization of career transition. Career transition is real. You're not going to do just one thing. The New England Centenarian Project did a study of folks who lived to be 100, and they found that they reinvented themselves every 7 to 8 years. So, it actually has kind of a longevity construct if we look at it positively and not as a burden. And then thinking about, flexible work exchanges, making work for them, and get the job, and the skills will follow. And I think more than ever we're seeing a lot of generationally folks who feel that way. Dr. Weiss, you want to close us up with these, just a recap?
So we discussed the Schlossberg model and transition, and so how you saw the 4 S's, how they can impact and be helpful. So there are all these types of transitions within transitions, as we discussed. And what do these types of transitions mean for, us as counselor educators, for our clients, for our students, and how we can put them into motion? We introduced you to the, different exercises around identifying transitions and how that can start a conversation, even with clients, as that question was asked, and for students, because, sometimes we do feel alone and we think we're the only one experiencing a transition. And how you can talk about, Dr. Zeng talked about the virtual fieldwork planning and experience, what it's like virtually now, what can be done differently if it has to be, especially ones that started off face-to-face versus, virtual, and how it changed because their sites changed. Their sites became virtual. It's not just a physical site. And I gave you a little overview of the agile approach to the faculty supervisors, how you can include your students in engaging them, how they can engage us in a different type of conversation. So at the end, you'll see with the presentation, we have our references and the handouts and any contact information. If you would like, just email us and we can email you those different handouts as well for you. Thank you again for attending. We hope you took something away from this presentation. We enjoyed, doing it. And this is something that Dr. Zeng and I enjoy, having these conversations about these different transitions.
Absolutely. Any questions as we close or comments, things that provoked thought or you'd like to share? Good. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Well, I hope you guys enjoy the rest of your day.
Yeah, enjoy and look forward to seeing some more of the great conference. So be well and take care.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.